Welcome to the human condition. In this episode, we explore one of humanity's most enduring and elusive questions: what is happiness? And is it truly worth pursuing as life's ultimate goal? From the teachings of ancient philosophers to the insights of modern psychology, happiness has been described as a fleeting feeling, a stable state of being, and even a moral responsibility. The pursuit of happiness can inspire us, but it can also trap us in a cycle of constant striving. Philosophers like Aristotle saw happiness, eudaimonia, not as a fleeting pleasure but as a flourishing life lived in virtue. Epicurus, on the other hand, claimed that happiness was found in simple pleasures and the absence of pain. In Buddhism, happiness emerges not from clinging but from letting go, from freeing oneself from desire. Christianity teaches that true happiness is rooted in love of God and neighbor, while Judaism frames joy as inseparable from duty and communal bonds. Literature, too, wrestles with happiness. Tolstoy's Anna Karenina illustrates the tension between passion and responsibility. Shakespeare's Hamlet wonders whether life's struggles outweigh life's joys, and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World warns of the dangers of artificially engineered bliss. Today, positive psychology reframes happiness as something that can be measured, cultivated, and taught. Yet existentialists like Viktor Frankl remind us that meaning, not happiness, may be our deepest need. So we must ask, is happiness the goal, or is it merely the byproduct of living with purpose, love, and courage? Before we can decide whether happiness is worth pursuing, we must first ask what it actually is. To some, happiness is pleasure, moments of joy, laughter, and comfort. To others, it is peace, an inner stillness unshaken by external storms. For many philosophers, happiness is not an emotion at all, but rather a state of flourishing and wholeness. Aristotle described it as the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue over a lifetime. Epicurus, by contrast, suggested happiness is the freedom from pain and fear, found in moderation and friendship. The Stoics believed happiness lies in aligning with reason and nature, accepting what we cannot control. In Buddhism, happiness is liberation, nirvana, freedom from suffering caused by attachment and desire. Christianity sees true joy as rooted in God's eternal presence, while Judaism emphasizes happiness through duty, community, and remembrance. Literature adds its own reflections. In Hamlet, Shakespeare reveals the fragility of joy amid suffering, while Tolstoy's characters often find happiness elusive, tied to meaning rather than pleasure. In modern psychology, happiness is often measured through subjective well-being surveys, tracking life satisfaction, emotional balance, and purpose. But can numbers ever capture something so complex? This complexity makes happiness both inspiring and frustrating to pursue. Perhaps our struggle begins not in chasing happiness, but in trying to define it too narrowly. Let's turn to the wisdom of ancient philosophy. Aristotle argued that happiness, or eudaimonia, was the ultimate purpose of life, achieved not through fleeting pleasures but through the cultivation of virtue. For him, happiness required living in accordance with reason, fulfilling our potential as rational beings. It was not about constant delight, but about long-term flourishing, courage, wisdom, and justice practiced daily. Epicurus, however, offered a different vision. He believed happiness was found in the absence of pain and fear, achieved through simplicity, friendship, and reflection. Contrary to stereotypes, he did not advocate for indulgence, but for moderation. His idea of pleasure was not excess, but tranquility, freedom from unnecessary desires. Both views remind us that happiness is more than emotional highs. It requires discipline and perspective. These ideas influence centuries of thought, shaping religious and cultural traditions. Even today, they challenge us. Are we happier when we strive for excellence and meaning, or when we simplify our desires? Perhaps true happiness requires both, flourishing in virtue while savoring life's small, quiet joys. Religion has always wrestled with the question of happiness. In Buddhism, happiness is found in detachment from craving and aversion. Desire, the Buddha taught, is the root of suffering, and only by releasing attachment can we experience freedom. Christianity frames happiness not as worldly pleasure but as the joy of divine love, enduring even in suffering. Blessed are those who mourn, Jesus says in the Beatitudes, pointing to a joy that transcends sorrow. Judaism adds another layer. Happiness is tied to obligation, memory, and community. Festivals like Sukkot celebrate joy, but joy is always linked to covenant and responsibility. Across these traditions, happiness is never merely about the self. It is about aligning with something greater, whether the divine, the sacred community, or the transcendent order of reality. These teachings remind us that happiness may not be about chasing satisfaction, but about surrender, duty, and faith. And yet, each tradition also leaves us with a paradox. Happiness cannot be forced, but it arises when we stop clinging and begin living rightly. The Stoics offered yet another perspective on happiness. They taught that happiness is not found in wealth, pleasure, or success, but in aligning with nature and reason. Epicurus, a former slave, argued that true freedom, and thus happiness, comes when we distinguish between what is in our control and what is not. External circumstances may bring pain or disappointment, but our inner response remains ours to govern. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, reflected in his Meditations that happiness comes not from avoiding suffering, but from embracing life as it unfolds, with courage and virtue. Seneca warned against the pursuit of luxury and fame, insisting that peace of mind comes from simplicity and wisdom. To the Stoics, happiness is not the absence of struggle, but the cultivation of resilience. This view resonates deeply today, in an age where so much lies outside our control: politics, economics, global crises. The Stoics remind us that happiness need not collapse when life grows difficult. In fact, adversity can be the training ground for wisdom. By cultivating acceptance, rationality, and inner strength, we discover a happiness that cannot be taken from us. In the modern era, happiness has been studied scientifically. Positive psychology, pioneered by Martin Seligman and others, asks how we can measure and cultivate well-being. Researchers often distinguish between hedonic happiness, pleasure and comfort, and eudaimonic happiness, purpose and fulfillment. Studies reveal that while wealth and comfort do affect happiness, their impact is limited. Beyond a certain point, material gains bring diminishing returns. Instead, relationships, gratitude, kindness, and a sense of meaning play a far greater role. Practices like journaling, meditation, and volunteering consistently raise levels of life satisfaction. Neuroscience also shows that happiness can be trained, as neural pathways strengthen through habits of gratitude and compassion. Yet critics caution that measuring happiness through surveys risks oversimplifying its complexity. Can a single scale capture the depth of a life well lived? Perhaps happiness is better seen as a process than a destination, a rhythm of meaning woven into daily practice. Modern science affirms much of what ancient wisdom already suggested. Happiness is not in things but in connection, virtue, and intentional living. Literature offers some of the richest reflections on happiness. Shakespeare's Hamlet famously asks, "To be or not to be," probing whether existence itself outweighs suffering. In his tragedies, Shakespeare often portrays joy as fragile, fleeting, and intertwined with sorrow. Tolstoy, in novels like Anna Karenina and War and Peace, shows that happiness is inseparable from moral struggle and the search for meaning. Bertrand Russell, in his essays, argued that happiness comes not from self-absorption but from turning outward toward love, work, and curiosity. Aldous Huxley, in Brave New World, imagined a society engineered for artificial happiness, warning that a life without suffering may also be a life without depth. Emily Dickinson's poetry reflects on happiness as fleeting and bittersweet, bound up with mortality. Even Jane Austen in her novels frames happiness within social duty and virtue, questioning whether romantic fulfillment is ever enough. These works reveal that happiness is never simple. It is fragile, contradictory, and often found in unexpected places. Literature gives voice to the complexities that philosophy and science sometimes flatten. In its beauty, it reminds us that the pursuit of happiness is as much a story we live as it is a goal we chase. Existentialist philosophers approached happiness with suspicion. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that humans are condemned to be free, and this freedom often leads not to happiness but to anxiety. Happiness for Sartre cannot be a final goal because we are constantly creating ourselves through choices. Albert Camus, in The Myth of Sisyphus, confronted the absurdity of existence. Life has no ultimate meaning, yet we persist in seeking it. For Camus, happiness is found in rebellion, embracing life fully despite its absurdity, like Sisyphus smiling as he pushes his eternal boulder. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, offered a more hopeful perspective in man's search for meaning. He argued that happiness cannot be pursued directly. It arises as a byproduct of meaning, love, and responsibility. For Frankl, even in suffering, we can find dignity by choosing our attitude and living for something greater. Existentialists challenge us to ask, is happiness truly the goal, or is meaning deeper? Perhaps, as Camus suggested, happiness is not about resolution, but about living courageously within life's unanswered questions. While happiness has long been revered, many argue that the very pursuit of happiness undermines it. Psychologists call this the paradox of happiness. The harder we chase it, the further it slips away. Studies show that those who obsess over being happy often end up lonelier and more dissatisfied. Philosophers like John Stuart Mill warned that happiness should never be pursued directly. Instead, it is a byproduct of engaging in meaningful work and love. Religious traditions often agree, teaching that joy comes not from self-centered striving but from surrender, service, or trust in God. Literature echoes this lesson. Characters who single-mindedly chase joy often end in ruin, while those who live authentically find happiness unexpectedly. This critique forces us to reconsider, is the problem happiness itself or our approach to it? Perhaps happiness is not a destination at the end of the road, but a companion that joins us when we walk with intention, humility, and gratitude. A key distinction in philosophy is the difference between happiness and pleasure. Pleasure is immediate, sensory, and fleeting. A delicious meal, a beautiful sunset, a good laugh. Happiness, by contrast, suggests something more enduring, a life of meaning, virtue, and coherence. The danger arises when we confuse the two. Chasing pleasures can leave us emptier than before, like drinking salt water when thirsty. Aristotle warned against equating pleasure with happiness, insisting that flourishing requires discipline and purpose. Yet pleasures also matter. They remind us of life's beauty and provide joy in the present moment. The question then is balance. How do we savor life's pleasures without mistaking them for lasting fulfillment? Perhaps the challenge is not to reject pleasure, but to see it as part of a larger pattern of well-being, a pattern that includes love, purpose, resilience, and virtue. Happiness then becomes less about accumulation and more about harmony. Happiness is not defined the same way in every culture. In many Western societies, happiness is tied to individual success, freedom, and self-expression. The American Declaration of Independence even enshrines the pursuit of happiness as a right. In Eastern traditions, however, happiness is often framed in communal and relational terms. Confucianism emphasizes harmony, duty, and the joy of fulfilling one's role in the community. In Japanese culture, the concept of ikigai, a reason for being, links happiness to purpose, contribution, and balance. Indigenous traditions around the world often connect happiness with harmony between people, land, and spirit. These differences remind us that happiness is not universal in definition or pursuit. What counts as happiness in one culture may seem hollow in another. Yet across traditions, one theme emerges: Happiness is less about what we own and more about how we live together. Another layer in this discussion is the relationship between happiness and legacy. Is happiness only about what we feel in the present, or does it also include what we leave behind? Some argue that true happiness cannot be divorced from the meaning of our actions over time. Parents often find joy in sacrifice for children, even if it diminishes their own pleasure. Artists, scientists, and leaders frequently endure suffering for the sake of leaving something that outlasts them. In religious traditions, happiness is sometimes linked to eternity, whether through salvation, remembrance, or spiritual continuity. Literature, too, reflects this. Characters who embrace legacy, like Tolstoy's Levin in Anna Karenina, often find a deeper form of happiness than those who seek only personal fulfillment. Perhaps happiness is not just about how we feel now, but how our lives resonate through time. It is both present joy and enduring meaning. In today's world, happiness has become a commodity. Self-help books, apps, wellness retreats, and products all promise happiness, often for a price. Social media encourages us to perform happiness, curating smiling images while concealing loneliness or struggle. This creates pressure, turning happiness into an obligation rather than a gift. Critics call this the happiness industry, where the quest for joy is exploited by marketing and consumerism. But does buying more really bring us closer to flourishing? Evidence suggests not. In fact, consumerism often deepens anxiety and comparison. True happiness, philosophers and psychologists remind us, arises not from external purchases but from internal practices and relationships. The danger of the happiness industry is not just its failure to deliver, it distracts us from more meaningful pursuits: love, purpose, community, and truth. Happiness cannot be sold, it must be lived. So what should we make of the pursuit of happiness? Perhaps happiness is not a flawed goal, nor a perfect one, but a paradox. It is worth seeking, yet never directly. It can inspire, but it can also mislead. The lesson from philosophy, religion, literature, and psychology is that happiness is not one thing. It is a tapestry woven of pleasure and pain, joy and sorrow, virtue and meaning. To live well is to embrace happiness not as a final destination, but as a rhythm, a way of being. When we live with courage, love, gratitude, and purpose, happiness tends to emerge as a companion. When we chase it desperately, it tends to flee. The wisdom of ages suggests that happiness is best approached sideways, by pursuing truth, goodness, and beauty. In the end, happiness may be less about asking, "Am I happy?" and more about asking, "Am I living well?" To continue your journey in reflecting on happiness, here are some essential resources that bring together philosophy, literature, psychology, and modern science. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is perhaps the foundation of Western thought on happiness, presenting the idea of eudaimonia, a flourishing life achieved through virtue. John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism provides a consequentialist view, suggesting happiness is the ultimate measure of morality. Bertrand Russell's The Conquest of Happiness takes a modern angle, critiquing common causes of misery and offering pathways to joy through balance and clarity. The Dalai Lama XIV and Howard Cutler's The Art of Happiness bridges Eastern Buddhist wisdom with Western psychology, offering practical guidance for inner peace. Immanuel Kant's Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals argues, happiness alone cannot be life's highest aim without moral duty, a challenge that deepens our reflections. Shakespeare's Hamlet asks the timeless question of what makes life worth living, wrestling with despair and meaning. Voltaire's Candide satirizes blind optimism, forcing us to consider whether happiness is cultivated through perspective or resilience. Podcasts like Philosophize This by Stephen West make the history of philosophy accessible, including nuanced explorations of happiness across cultures and eras. The Happiness Lab with Dr. Laurie Santos uses psychology and real-world studies to question what actually makes us happy, often dismantling common assumptions. Websites such as the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy provide comprehensive, peer-reviewed entries on happiness, ethics, and human flourishing. The Greater Good Science Center from UC Berkeley shares cutting-edge research on well-being, emotional resilience, and the social dimensions of happiness. Together, these resources form a toolkit for reflection and self-discovery. They challenge us to see happiness not as a shallow goal, but as a profound and multifaceted pursuit. By engaging with philosophy, literature, and science, we begin to understand that happiness may not be a final destination, but rather a lifelong process of meaning-making. Each resource asks us to reconsider whether happiness is fleeting pleasure, moral alignment, narrative coherence, or something else entirely. And as we turn these questions inward, we shape our own definition of fulfillment. As we conclude, we return to the essential question: is the pursuit of happiness a worthy goal, or is it flawed by its very nature? Philosophers across time disagree. Aristotle believed happiness was the highest good, attained through virtue and balance. John Stuart Mill argued that happiness should be maximized for all, tying personal joy to collective well-being. Existentialists like Viktor Frankl remind us that meaning, not happiness, may be the true measure of fulfillment, and that happiness may arise only as a side effect of purpose. Religious traditions deepen this reflection. Christianity often views happiness as rooted in love, service, and eternal communion with God rather than worldly success. Buddhism warns that clinging to happiness creates suffering, urging instead the cultivation of compassion and non-attachment. Hindu philosophy, through the Bhagavad Gita, presents fulfillment as harmony with Dharma, the sacred duty of one's life path. These traditions remind us that happiness may not be an end in itself, but part of a larger moral and spiritual journey. Literary voices also add nuance. Shakespeare, through Hamlet's soliloquy, reveals the anguish of existence when happiness feels unattainable. Tolstoy shows us characters destroyed by false forms of happiness and saved through authentic connection. Voltaire, in Candide, concludes that the pursuit of abstract happiness often leads to suffering, suggesting instead a life of grounded, mindful work. Modern psychology adds a final perspective, showing that happiness often arises not from wealth or achievement, but from relationships, gratitude, and engagement in meaningful activities. Yet even here there is caution. Turning happiness into a checklist risks making it more elusive. Perhaps then happiness is best seen as a companion on life's journey, not the destination. In the end, the pursuit of happiness challenges us to define what truly matters, and in that search we uncover not only joy but the depth of our humanity. Whether fleeting or enduring, happiness remains both a mystery and a guide,